US President Donald Trump has just signed off on the US National Security Strategy for 2025, and it is a remarkable document, especially with respect to US priorities vis-a-vis the European Union and Ukraine in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It basically codifies in writing what many of us have suspected is the current White House's strategy, which leans heavily pro-Russian and very negative towards the European Union's institutions and Ukraine defending itself successfully in the Russo-Ukrainian war against Russian aggression. And this particular document, remember, it's 2025, we look back to 2017, and the same Donald Trump in the first Trump administration and national security strategy, it was remarkably different. There, the language was all about NATO and Russia, NATO as an ally, and the importance of US-Europe relations and cooperation, and identified Russia effectively as an adversary. However, in 2025, Russia is not seen as an adversary, and in fact, NATO, the US has put in writing that it does not want NATO to expand any further, and actually calls into question the whole idea of the US living up to its Article 5 NATO treaty obligation to support a member state that might be attacked, in particular by Russia, which is really the only aggressor that seems on the horizon at the moment. So it is really truly a remarkable shift in US foreign policy. It is the White House's document. Of course, there are checks and balances within the US political system, and the Ukrainian cause and US-EU relations remain popular with the majority of Americans, and in fact with the majority of Republican voters. And on the Hill in DC, there are many Republican politicians that are going to push back against these priorities now set out in writing. This is the remarkable part. It is a process that started, if we think back to the Munich Security Conference, which I made a video about here on this geopolitics channel. It was back at the beginning of the year, where J.D. Vance, the US president, stood up and said that the EU, in effect, and Western European governments are a bigger threat to Europe than Russia or China, which was an absolutely outrageous statement to make, especially in that setting when we've got the biggest war in Europe since World War II, launched by Russia, first starting back in 2014 and then in 2022, with hundreds of thousands of people dead on the continent of Europe. So let's look in this short video on the US's priorities with respect to Europe and Russia, Ukraine, and how this ties in with the current US strategy, and why, for once and for all, because I've had to argue and debate with a lot of people over the last 10 months about the intentions of the Trump administration, we'll say the MAGA movement at large, and how it sets out kind of incontrovertibly that they are hostile to the European Union, hostile to Ukraine, and pretty friendly with Russia. So, as I said, I put the document down below in the description. You can go read it and check everything. And these points with respect to US-EU relations come up, and Ukraine come up in a few different parts in the document. However, the US has listed its priorities for Europe. They put them out in terms of bullet points, so we just go through them. The one is to restore internal European and Europe-Russia stability. So that is the priority for US foreign policy. It is not to see Russia defeated. It is not to see necessarily Russia contained. It is not to see Russia be unsuccessful in its attempts to take over Ukraine and perhaps attack another country in Europe that presumably would be a NATO member state. It is to restore internal European stability and EU, well, it said Europe, it didn't say the EU, Europe-Russia stability. So that is the priority. That is very different to what we would have assumed would have been the priority back in 2017 if there had been an extended invasion like we saw in 2022. Second one, help Europe act as a cohesive sovereign nations responsible for their own defense. Now this is a very interesting statement because it says cohesive sovereign nations. It does not mean the European Union. It actually means acting independently of the European Union. So that is a pretty strong statement against European integration, something that the US has traditionally supported in the last 80 years. And for their own defense, much to be read into that, it seems to imply that they need to be taking care of all their own defense. So the US is not involved at all, which would again suggest that the US is not willing to support in any sort of meaningful way a NATO member state, a European member state that is attacked by Russia, which could happen in the next few years. Nor does it suggest the US is supportive of a European Union army or a collective European defensive entity outside of NATO. In effect, this means that the main raison d'etre for NATO is now, for now, is completely obsolete, in the sense that, well, most countries join NATO or stay in NATO to have that security guarantee from the United States. Now it seems that that is very unreliable under the current administration. Of course, the US can change its political direction and its leadership because it is a liberal democracy that has regular elections with peaceful changes of power. So for the moment, that is extremely disconcerting and worrying if you are a country like Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, even Finland. Support, this is the third point, support resistance to current harmful political courses. That suggests that the US foreign policy is about interfering in domestic politics across the European continent. Again, something that we've already seen from J.D. Vance. If you think back to the Munich Security Conference, he then effectively openly supported and campaigned for the AfD, which is a minority party in the Bundestag in Germany that is extremely pro-Kremlin and very against supporting Ukraine in this war, and of course against the European Union. Also, he supported Gheorghe Simonyan for the Romanian presidency. He was again a very anti-Ukrainian candidate, a very favorable candidate to Moscow. So you can see how this ties in with the US no longer supporting Ukraine in the Russo-Ukrainian war, although of course for now they still sell weapons to Ukraine via the other European allies, and they do supply some intel. However, the Ukrainians just published their figures for the support they received from allies, and basically since the Trump administration has taken over, they have gotten zero support from the United States in terms of weapons directly, or from new weapons directly, or in terms of financial support. So this is another very hostile priority for the United States with respect to European integration and European cohesion and support between the United States and a united Europe. Number 4 is open EU markets to US goods and ensure fair treatment for US workers and business. I think that's a kind of a standard priority, is to help US businesses, though there's been a lot of controversy with, for example, some of the tech bros and their companies that they fall foul of EU regulations, and this seems to be an attempt to help those kind of companies. We saw also J.D. Vance making a statement yesterday to that effect, because Twitter got fined by the European Union's institution, by the European Commission. Number 5, strengthen Central, Eastern, and Southern European nations via trade, arms sales, and exchanges. Quite curious, this one. They seem to focus in, and I'm not sure exactly which countries they refer to, but Central Europe would be many of the countries in the European Union and NATO, like Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, maybe even Austria. But Eastern and Southern European nations could be Italy, it could mean countries in the Balkans, it could even mean Russia. That's Eastern Europe, for example. They are not really doing much exchanges, arms sales, or trade with Ukraine. And they are, in the course of these negotiations between the White House and the Kremlin, talking a lot about doing business with Russia. Number 6, counter the perception and reality of NATO as endlessly expanding. That looks like it's just lifted off a Russian talking point with respect to the Russo-Ukrainian war. There, they basically say that they're not going to agree to NATO getting any bigger, no matter what happens. That is effectively, I'm not sure if we could say it's giving Moscow a veto over NATO membership, but it's basically via the US creating a situation where there is now going to be just a veto on anyone else joining for whatever reason. Again, does NATO really make much sense with Donald Trump and this administration in charge? It's the main reason that is now gone. And the final one is push Europe to act against overcapacity, tech theft, cyber espionage, and other hostile economic practices. Overcapacity, that just seems like a way of saying that they will continue to throw tariffs at Europe, claiming that they overproduce stuff that they would then naturally be exporting to the US. Donald Trump has made reducing the trade deficit in the US one of his priorities. Again, seems to go against, in terms of goods and not necessarily services, which the US actually exports a lot, but they do import a lot of goods. It seems to lack a basic understanding of international trade. The trade relationship between the United States and the European Union is the biggest in the world, and he's putting that in jeopardy with the tariffs, with this hostile attitude towards the European Union and other trade barrier measures, while all the time talking about increasing trade with Russia, a country which historically they haven't traded very much with, but they don't really need that much stuff from, and would be minuscule in terms of the amount of money involved in the US-EU trade relationship. So very, very strange decision in terms of the economy, and at a time when, well, the cost of living has exploded in the United States. So kind of interesting as we look at the midterms towards this time next year in the United States. If that continues, that would be a big problem for Donald Trump's Republican Party in terms of maintaining power on Capitol Hill. So let me go into just some of the other paragraphs in this document. Again, I encourage you to read it. It's pretty easy. Some of the language is quite remarkable. Again, Russia is not seen as an adversary in this document. Yes, you heard that correctly. Russia is not an adversary, but the EU is really painted as one. So I'll just give you an example where they're referring to the economic decline of Europe in general in terms of its share of global GDP over the last, say, 35 years. But this economic decline is eclipsed by the real and more stark prospect of civilizational erasure. So a very dramatic statement. The larger issues facing Europe include activities of the European Union and other transnational bodies that undermine political liberty and sovereignty, migration policies that are transforming the continent and creating strife, censorship of free speech and suppression of political opposition, creating birth rates and loss of national identities and self-confidence. So there you see that is basically identifying the European Union as being undermining Europe in a sense. Again, extremely hostile. You don't see the Kremlin cited in those kind of terms when they've actually launched a war against a European country and are increasingly hostile with what's referred as hybrid war, but it's basically gray zone operations against many European countries. Even in my home country, Ireland, there is suspicion that those drones that suddenly were hovering at the time when Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky was arriving in Dublin may have been some sort of plausible assassination attempt by Russia that didn't work out because the plane arrived too early. But we've seen the drones in Poland. We've seen the sabotage in Poland recently on the rail lines. We've seen Russian planes regularly violating NATO airspace in countries like Estonia. So we've seen the poisonings in Salisbury in London, even going back a few years. You have all these hostile acts by Russia, but they are not identified. Apparently, they are not seen as an adversary for the United States, but the European Union and its policies of European integration, which, according to the White House, undermine political liberty and sovereignty. Well, by its very nature, pooling in sovereignty amongst countries undermines the sovereignty of those particular nations. It definitely weakens it on an individual basis, but of course the idea is that they're stronger together than they are as individual member states, pretty much like the original colonies of the United States itself. They didn't all start trying to act independently and not have a transnational, I guess you can say, a superior polity that would be able to, on the federal level, work in the interests of all of them together, rather than trying to deal with France or United Kingdom as individual small states. It's kind of the similar idea. Obviously, the US then became a full federation, whilst European Union at the moment is a mix. It is actually a hybrid of confederation with a federation. But again, migration policies, that seems to be something, is other language in the document to do with this civilization erasure is referred to here, but basically pointing out or identifying European immigration policies as been a threat to the countries. There's some other hyperbolic language in the document about basically that some countries will be majority, I guess, immigrant within the next generation, which there's no actual statistical support to give evidence to that. It's not like France, which is, I think, definitely has the most Muslims in Europe. I still think it's like a little bit over 10%. It's not going to become a majority within my lifetime at the current trends, at least, and that is just one. The country which has the biggest, we'll say, most controversial in terms of immigration levels, in terms of what its current position. Other parts here, the censorship of free speech, that has been something that J.D. Vance has been talking about way back in Munich as well, when he was campaigning for, along with Elon Musk, for the AfD in German, Alternative für Deutschland, that there's censorship of free speech, that these pretty pro-Kremlin candidates, that's kind of a big overlap, or points of view are suppressed in Europe, and that the political opposition that in general turns out to be pro-Kremlin is doesn't get enough, I guess, time on the airwaves or whatever it is, and that we have creating birth rates. Well, that I actually agree with. We do have very low fertility rates in most of Europe, and the loss of national identities and self-confidence, well, they're not going to be completely lost. Europe is obviously, the European Union has countries that pool their sovereignty. Most people still maintain their national identity for now, as opposed to a greater European identity. It's a bit like if people felt more Texan. I guess probably when they joined the United States, they might still have felt more Texan than maybe American for the first while. And these things that are identified as undermining Europe. So it's quite a remarkable departure. As I said, like, the US has been one of the biggest supporters of European integration, European Union. If we go back to Kissinger, he's supposed to have quipped that, who do I call when I call Europe, because everything is so fragmented, and basically the US has seen as its priority over the last 80 odd years solidifying European integration so that there aren't wars in Europe that US in World War I and World War II got dragged into. And this is basically doing the opposite, is identifying that as a strategic interest of the US to undermine. Of course, all of this, you see Russia basically not being seen as an adversary. There's also, I'm not sure if I have highlighted it here, that there is a priority for the ending the US, Freudian slip, the Russo-Ukrainian war, ending it as soon as possible, basically getting to a deal, no matter what that deal is. We've seen that for Donald Trump and his desperation basically to try and reach out to Russia and make, well, concessions to Russia in a way, and that's like he keeps promising to introduce sanctions or take other measures against Russia, and then inevitably seems to backtrack on nearly all of that when the Russians just give him the runaround and don't actually commit to a ceasefire as he demanded in the beginning. Ukrainians agreed to it now. He basically refuses to agree to what the US has negotiated as a peace agreement. He has no intention of signing any of that, as I predicted 2 weeks ago when I reviewed the 28-point peace plan that more or less was written in the Kremlin. He's now come out and said that basically threatened Europe and demanded that either Ukraine capitulate, or he's just going to make even more demands, like claim that here in Odessa, where I'm sitting, is also part of Russia. So quite remarkable to see this 180 turn by the United States officially as White House policy, as opposed to what we've seen in the behavior of this White House. Of course, we're simplifying a little bit. You do have different factions within the US government. You have the US Congress, which also acts as a counterweight to the presidency. The US is not a dictatorship. It's not Russia. So this document sets out the strategy of the White House. However, it does not mean that the US will actually be able to, in a coordinated sense, carry this out because of the checks and balances with respect to foreign policy. Congress has still a lot of influence, and with the upcoming elections, I actually watched some of the pro-Russian commentary, and they actually agreed with what I said maybe about 2 weeks ago, that by the end of the spring, probably Donald Trump is not going to be so useful to them anymore, because basically with the midterms coming up, he probably will start to lose a lot of influence, since his approval ratings, in particular with respect to his handling of the Russo-Ukrainian war, are at record low levels, and he will be an issue for the Republican Party, looking at what's happened in the recent elections over the last few weeks, where the Democrats, there's a big swing to the Democrats, and if you look at independent voters, they basically are extremely unhappy with the Trump 2 administration. So with respect to all this coming to fruition, I don't think that that's probably likely to be the case. However, the fact that this document is so remarkably different to the previous 80 years of US foreign policy, and what Donald Trump in his first document of a similar type in 2017 actually wrote, is definitely historical. And there are other elements that I will go into in other videos over the next few days, in particular with the Monroe Doctrine, which basically means that which is 19th century doctrine, where the United States wants to have complete domination in the Western Hemisphere. That is outlined in this document as well. Basically, overall, they see China as their main adversary. They don't see the US as being the global policeman, and they don't see Russia as an adversary. That means that there's going to be a lot of chaos if they follow this strategy, and a lot of friction in the Western Hemisphere. We're seeing possibly military action by the US against Venezuela on the cards. We'll just have to see if that comes to pass or not. Drop your comments down below in the comment section here. Let me know what you think of the document. I encourage you to take a read of at least focus in on the parts to do with Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. You can also read the part about the Monroe document with the Trump quarterly, as it's called, and tell me what you think. Is this such a, as I've outlined, a radical departure from previous US administrations? Does it just tell us what we already could have guessed? And does it put to bed any arguments made by pro-Ukrainians who supported Trump that this is just 4D chess by a remarkable negotiator, but in the end, he is actually trying to help Ukraine? So on note, I'll say do побачення from Odessa, free Odessa in free Ukraine.